Have you looked at the cultural and religious landscape lately and felt completely, utterly homeless? You're not alone. The center has collapsed. We're watching both the extremes of the right and the left trade the grueling work of justice for the intoxicating adrenaline of the mob. We're watching a nation's death in real time. Welcome to The Faithful Citizen. In this episode, we open the most difficult chapters in the Bible, Judges 19 to 21, to find a prophetic blueprint for our current crisis. We examine what happens when the priesthood becomes complicit, when institutions sacrifice the vulnerable to save the empire, and why the only way to survive the culture war is to drop our swords and head into the wilderness.
Yeah. Welcome to the space where conviction meets rhythm, where truth got a mic and the church gotta listen. This ain't Sunday talk, it's real life living. Faith in motion, the citizen's mission. We talk grace, we talk justice, we talk peace. Not the kind that conforms, but the kind that frees the world's loud with noise. We cut through division, this is the faithful citizen. Let's get to the wisdom.
Over the past several weeks on Substack and Threads, we've been walking through the book of Judges together, pausing daily to reflect on this ancient text, chapter by chapter. It's been an exhausting, sobering journey. Reading Judges is like watching a slow-motion collapse on an infinite loop. As we moved from Othniel to Gideon and from Jephthah to Samson, we were reminded, chapter after bloody chapter, of a terrifying reality. Humanity has an uncanny, near-pathological inability to learn from its own history. We repeat the same cycles of idolatry, compromise, and violence, arrogant enough to believe that this time our autonomy will yield a different result. The book of Judges doesn't end with a triumphant blast of trumpets. There's no heroic deliverer, no sweeping revival, and no golden era of peace. Instead, the narrative grinds to a halt on a chilling, repetitive refrain, a terminal diagnosis of total moral collapse. For generations, modern society has been sold the lie that radical autonomy is the highest good. We've convinced ourselves that if we cast off absolute truth and become our own kings, we'll finally build a utopia. But the broken final pages of Judges prove the exact opposite. Freedom without truth isn't a paradise, it's a slaughterhouse. As we navigate the wilderness of our current cultural moment, this text reads less like history and more like a forensic audit of the present. We're watching the death of a nation in real time, and the symptoms are identical. The societal center has completely eroded, leaving the politically and theologically moderate entirely homeless. We're stranded in a no-man's land between towering extremes. Yet when you strip away the partisan rhetoric, both the extremes of the right and the left are using the same brutal, dehumanizing tactics to achieve their ends. Both sides have traded the grueling, restorative work of justice for the intoxicating adrenaline of the mob. As we reach the end of our daily reflections, we must delve deeper into Judges 19 to 21. The horrors of these final chapters are arguably the darkest sequence in the entire biblical canon. They show us what happens when a foreign empire doesn't conquer a society, but implodes from its own internal rot. These chapters are a prophetic blueprint for a dying nation. They hold up an unflinching mirror to our own architecture of complicity, revealing what happens when spiritual leaders operate entirely in the flesh, when institutions gladly sacrifice the vulnerable to protect the powerful, and when justice is replaced by retaliatory, scorched earth vengeance. When everyone does what's right in their own eyes, the vulnerable are the first to bleed, and the sanctuary is inevitably transformed into a hunting ground. It's time to look into the abyss of Judges 19 to 21, not to despair, but to diagnose the rot and understand the absolute necessity of abandoning the empire's false altars. If you want to understand a nation's spiritual decay, you don't begin by examining the politicians or the outlaws. You begin by examining the priesthood. Judges 19 opens by introducing us to a Levite. By divine design, the tribe of Levi was set apart as Israel's moral compass. tasked with guarding the sanctuary, teaching the law, and interceding for the people. But this Levite isn't serving in the tabernacle. He's wandering morally adrift and retrieving a runaway concubine. He's a man meant to represent the holy priesthood, yet he operates entirely in the flesh. This compromised priest is the ancient counterpart to the modern religious machine. He perfectly mirrors the tragic collapse of the evangelical mind, a leadership class that deliberately traded its prophetic voice for a seat at the table. For decades, the architects of our modern religious institutions convinced themselves they could preserve their moral authority while adopting the empire's pragmatic, self-preserving tactics. But when the shepherds prioritize their own utility, comfort, and institutional security over the gospel's grueling demands, the nation's spiritual immune system shuts down. The Levite is orthodox in title but completely bankrupt in soul. As evening falls on his journey home, the Levite makes a calculated tribal decision. He refuses to spend the night in the pagan city of Jebus, Jerusalem, insisting instead on pressing on to Gibeah, a city belonging to the Israelite tribe of Benjamin. He assumes that because he's among his own people, the covenant community, he'll be safe. It's a fatal assumption. The sun goes down, and the men of the city surround the house where the Levite is staying. They beat on the door, demanding that the host bring the Levite out so they can rape him. This moment shatters the comfortable theology of religious exceptionalism. These men aren't Philistines or Canaanites. They're Israelites, members of the tribe of Benjamin, yet their behavior is indistinguishable from that of the pagan men of Sodom. The text forces us to look in the mirror and recognize a terrifying truth. When the church abandons God's authority, we don't merely become secular or neutral, we devolve. We descend into darkness that rivals the most depraved cultures on earth. The most terrifying villains in this chapter aren't foreign invaders. They're the covenant people of God who have completely lost their minds. Trapped inside the house, the old host tries to manage the crisis. He steps out to reason with the mob, begging them not to commit such a vile offense against his male guest. To appease their bloodlust, the host offers a horrific compromise. He offers to bring out his own virgin daughter and the Levite's concubine. "Do to them what seems good to you," he tells the men. The old man believes he's being righteous by upholding the ancient cultural laws of hospitality. Still, in reality, he's literally negotiating with demons by using the bodies of women. This is the precise mechanism of complicity that built the modern megachurch and the political apparatus that surrounds it. The host's horrific bargain is the ancient blueprint for every institutional cover-up, every signed non-disclosure agreement, and every strategic political alliance that demands looking the other way. We do this when we try to find the lesser of two evils in a corrupt system. We think we can appease a hostile culture or protect the sacred institution by making calculated compromises. We convince ourselves that protecting the Levite, the pastor, the politician, the brand, the titans of the faith, is a holy duty that justifies the collateral damage. But the mathematics of institutional pragmatism are always soaked in blood. When you negotiate with absolute evil, you always end up sacrificing the innocent on the altar. The priesthood has officially traded the sanctuary for the slaughterhouse, and the darkest hours of the night have only just begun. The narrative of Judges 19 pivots abruptly from cowardly negotiation to active, calculated betrayal. The mob outside the door is relentless, unsatisfied with the host's horrific offer. At this moment, the Levite has a choice. A true priest, a true shepherd, lays down his life for the sheep. But the Levite isn't a shepherd, he's an institutional pragmatist. To save his own skin, he commits an act of unspeakable cowardice. He seizes his concubine and forces her out into the dark. And then, perhaps the most devastating detail of the entire ordeal, he goes back inside and shuts the door. That locked door is a damning indictment of our utter lack of courage. It's the ancient architectural blueprint for the modern bureaucratic machine. The institutional church has a horrifying history of locking its doors to the abused. When pressure mounts, when a scandal threatens the budget, or when the culture bays for blood, the modern religious establishment operates exactly like the Levite. We push victims out into the cold, prioritizing public relations, comfort, and the security of the religious establishment over the safety of the broken. This is the dark, functional logic of what we've previously called the modern NICE. When a man of status requires protection, a woman of lesser status is always available to be sacrificed on the altar of institutional preservation. The institution survives. The vulnerable are consumed. The night passes. While the concubine is brutally tortured and left for dead at the threshold, the Levite remains safely inside. The text implies a chilling reality. He apparently slept soundly as she was tortured to death on the front porch. When morning comes, the Levite opens the door to go on his way. He expects to resume his journey entirely unbothered by the cost of his survival. He steps over her broken body and utters words that should freeze the blood of any reader. "Get up, let us be going." There are no tears, there's no horror. There's only profound sociopathic deadness. He speaks to her not as a traumatized human being, but as an inconvenient obstacle to his itinerary. Today, the institutional church rarely uses those exact words, yet it employs the same vocabulary of dismissal. We tell victims of spiritual and physical abuse to forgive and forget. We hand them non-disclosure agreements. We tell congregations that we must move on for the sake of the ministry after a powerful predator is quietly relocated. We step over the broken bodies of those crushed by the machinery and demand that they stop delaying the empire's progress. This is the final, fatal stage of spiritual apostasy, the complete death of empathy. You can possess perfect doctrinal statements, magnificent sanctuaries, and immense political influence. Still, when a religious system becomes entirely callous to the human suffering at its own doorstep, it's entirely bankrupt. A church that can't weep is already dead, but the concubine doesn't respond to his command because she's dead. The Levite now faces a crisis. His human shield is gone, and he holds undeniable evidence of his own horrific cowardice. If the truth gets out that he threw his own concubine to a mob to save himself while he slept safely inside, his reputation will be ruined. He needs a distraction. He needs to control the narrative. He places her body on his donkey, travels home, and proceeds to commit one of the most grotesque acts in the biblical canon. He cuts her body into 12 pieces and sends them throughout the territory of Israel. This isn't an act of grief. It's a calculated performative spectacle. The man who refused to defend her in life now weaponizes her corpse for his own political vengeance. By sending her dismembered body to the tribes, he incites a national panic, successfully redirecting the outrage away from his own locked door and squarely onto the men of Gibeah. He controls the narrative, completely erasing his own complicity to rally a mob. This ancient manipulation is replicated perfectly in our modern digital and political age. We see this dynamic when toxic leaders whose cowardice or sin caused massive collateral damage suddenly pivot to self-righteous whistleblowers or culture warriors. When the rot within their own ministries is exposed, or when their complicity in systemic abuse threatens their platform, they don't repent. Instead, they scream about the woke mob, the secular agenda, or the shifting culture. They gladly exploit the very trauma they enabled to maintain their influence and start a war. Their deafening, performative outrage is merely a whitewash covering the blood on their own hands. When the dismembered pieces of the Levite's concubine arrive at the doorsteps of the 12 tribes, the shockwave is immediate. For the first time in the book of Judges, the fractured, idolatrous nation of Israel is suddenly unified. The text tells us that all the people arose as one man. But we must look closely at the nature of this assembly. They're not unified by a sudden desire for holiness, a return to the Torah, or a shared love for Yahweh. They're unified entirely by outrage. This is a devastatingly accurate mirror of the modern church. Too often, we can't find unity in our theology, mission, or love for one another. Yet the moment a cultural scandal erupts or a shared enemy is identified, we rally the troops. We mistake the electric adrenaline of a mob for the movement of the Holy Spirit. Yet a unity forged entirely in the fires of outrage is dangerous. It creates a mob, not a holy priesthood. The newly formed mob of Israel marches on the tribe of Benjamin and makes a reasonable just demand. Hand over the wicked men of Gibeah so the evil can be purged. But Benjamin refuses. Instead of excising the cancer, Benjamin goes to war to protect the tumors. This is the deadly, intoxicating pull of tribalism. We see it constantly in our modern institutions and denominations. When a prominent leader falls or when systemic abuse within a specific camp is exposed, the tribe instinct kicks in immediately. We'll fiercely defend our own corrupt leaders, institutions, and political affiliations against all outside accountability, consciously choosing loyalty to the tribe over loyalty to the truth. Benjamin looks at the undeniable atrocity committed by their own men and decides that protecting their tribal reputation is more important than achieving justice for a murdered woman. In the tribal mindset, the only unforgivable sin is admitting the other side is right. With diplomacy failing, Israel prepares for a righteous war against an unspeakable evil. They go before God with the strategic question, who shall go up first? They assume victory is a given. They just need God to rubber stamp the battle plan. But on the first day, Israel loses 22,000 men. Stunned, they return to battle on the second day and lose 18,000 more. Israel had the moral high ground. They were defending the vulnerable and seeking to punish absolute wickedness. So why did God allow them to be slaughtered? Because a righteous cause doesn't make you a righteous person. Israel was infected with the same moral rot as Benjamin. They simply had a better excuse to swing the sword. God used the wicked men of Benjamin to deeply humble the arrogant, self-righteous men of Israel before granting them victory. God will judge the judges before he lets them execute his justice. We see this profound humbling in the way Israel's prayers change. On day 1, they demand a military strategy to defeat their brothers. By day 3, after suffering massive casualties, their arrogance shatters. They fast, they weep, and they offer burnt offerings. Their prayer shifts from strategy to a posture of absolute surrender. Shall we go out once more to battle, or shall we cease? We love to approach God for military strategy to defeat the culture, mistaking our vengeance for his righteousness. We operate as prosecutors, cheering on the fire, completely forgetting our calling to be priests who intercede in the streets. But God often lets us fail repeatedly until we stop demanding a strategy and start offering our brokenness. Israel finally achieves victory on the third day, but it's an absolute slaughter. They kill 25,100 men of Benjamin and burn their cities to the ground. They nearly wiped out an entire tribe of Israel from the face of the earth. There's no joy in this victory. The text offers no triumphant song of praise. When the church fights its own civil wars, even when rooting out corruption, fighting over theology, or exposing institutional rot, the collateral damage is always devastating. The psychology of vengeance demands that we destroy the enemy, fueled by the dopamine rush of the dunk and the thrill of the culture war. But a culture war always leaves a graveyard. Even when the battle is necessary to purge evil, the aftermath is never a celebration. It's a graveyard that demands our weeping. The scales of justice, weighed down by human vengeance, leave both sides bleeding out in the dirt. When the smoke finally clears over the charred ruins of Gibeah, the intoxicating adrenaline of the culture war evaporates, leaving only the grim reality of the graveyard. The nation of Israel gathers at Bethel, sits before the Lord until evening, and lifts their voices in bitter weeping. They look at the ashes of Benjamin and mourn the realization that an entire tribe has been nearly amputated from the covenant body. Yet their grief rings hollow. They're weeping over the missing tribe, but they're the ones who just slaughtered them. We see this exact tragic hypocrisy repeated constantly in our modern institutions. Leaders and factions who wage vicious, scorched earth campaigns against their brothers, only to weep later over the church's decline and division. The gatekeepers will relentlessly purge dissenters, excommunicate the exiles, and destroy the lives of those who threaten their power, then stand in the pulpit to lament the shrinking congregation. But you can't launch a crusade of friendly fire and then pretend to be shocked by the body count. Israel now faces a profound crisis of their own making. In the heat of their self-righteous rage, they had rashly vowed before God never to give their daughters in marriage to any surviving Benjamite. Now, with only 600 men of Benjamin remaining and no women to marry them, the tribe faces imminent extinction. How does a holy nation resolve this? The biblical restorative answer is national repentance. They should have fallen on their faces, confessed the arrogance of their bloodlust, and begged God to release them from a vow forged in hatred. But the institutional machine doesn't know how to repent. Instead of repenting of the vow, they seek a pragmatic workaround. They audit the attendance records of their violent assembly and find that the city of Jabesh Gilead failed to send anyone to the war. Without hesitation, the elders send an army to slaughter the men, women, and children of Jabesh Gilead and kidnap 400 virgins to give to the surviving Benjamites. This is institutional pragmatism at its darkest. It's the terrifying reality of what happens when a religious system decides that preserving its own structures is more important than preserving human life. The church constantly tries to fix the consequences of its own theological errors or leadership failures by committing entirely new atrocities, sacrificing the innocent to preserve the system. When a mega church attempts to cover up the devastating fallout of a toxic pastor by enforcing predatory non-disclosure agreements, silencing whistleblowers, and orchestrating smear campaigns against victims, it's following the same playbook. It's slaughtering Jabesh Gilead to hide the shame of its own disastrous decisions. But the horror of Judges 21 isn't over. The 400 kidnapped virgins are insufficient to sustain Benjamin's survivors. So the elders of Israel devise yet another plan, plunging the nation into an abyss of absolute moral depravity. They tell the remaining Benjamites to hide in the vineyards at Shiloh and kidnap the young women as they come out to dance. The elders' logic for authorizing this mass abduction is profoundly and uniquely twisted. We didn't give them our daughters, so we didn't technically break our vow. It's the ultimate theological loophole. It's the terrifying moment when the letter of the law is weaponized to murder the spirit of the law. We see this exact brand of legalism weaponized today to protect the powerful. We cling fiercely to the letter of our self-righteous traditions while completely abandoning the heart of God's justice. We'll bend over backward to find a theological justification for a leader's predatory behavior, framing it as a moral failing rather than a crime, simply because they technically adhere to the denomination's doctrinal statement. But when you care more about protecting your technical piety than protecting people, your religion is demonic. Consider the profound betrayal the girls of Shiloh endured. The text tells us they were attending the yearly feast of the Lord. They didn't wander into a dark alley or a battlefield. They came to the sanctuary to worship and celebrate in safety. Instead, they were ambushed by the very men of Israel who were supposed to be their brothers, while the nation's elders explicitly sanctioned the abuse. As we reflect on the epidemic of abuse that's ravaged the modern church, we must confront the terrifying reality that the church has too often allowed its sanctuaries to become hunting grounds. A building isn't holy simply because it has a cross on the door or a well-funded worship band on stage. When leaders prioritize the institution's survival over the flock's safety, the altar becomes a trap. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. The book of Judges doesn't end with a heroic deliverance or a massive revival. It ends with an ominous, chilling summary of total moral collapse. This is the terminal diagnosis for any society or church that rejects the absolute authority of God. Modern culture celebrates radical autonomy, believing that being our own king will finally bring utopia and freedom. But as the bloody, chaotic, and broken pages of Judges prove, freedom without truth isn't paradise. It's a slaughterhouse. Today, as we watch the load-bearing pillars of our cultural and religious empires shake, we face a profound, terrifying temptation. It's the temptation of the spectator's hill. Like Jonah sitting outside Nineveh, we're prone to become spectators on the east wind, waiting to see what will happen to the city, secretly hoping for the fire. When we see the evangelical industrial complex collapse, or a corrupt political system exposed, our fleshly instinct is to cheer the destruction of our enemies. We're tempted to consume judgment as entertainment, refreshing our feeds like Romans at the Colosseum, waiting for the lions to be released. But we must recognize that this cycle of retaliatory justice, the desire to see the bad guy crushed and our tribe vindicated, only hastens a nation's death. If we celebrate the cities burning without weeping for its inhabitants, we've lost the very heart of the God we claim to serve. When justice is reduced to a gladiatorial event, there are no winners, only casualties remain. We must ask ourselves a terrifying question. Are we priests who intercede or prosecutors who destroy? A prosecutor seeks only to win the case, but a priest stands between the living and the dead to stop the plague. The American church has been heavily catechized by a machine that rewards vengeance and punishes justice. But for the faithful citizen, the mandate in this dying nation is clear. We must refuse to participate in their culture war. We must adopt the wilderness ethic. The wilderness ethic demands that we drop the sword and walk away from the empire's false battlefield. It means refusing to be swept up in the false unities of outrage that create mobs instead of holy priesthoods. It requires us to dismantle the theological loopholes and institutional pragmatism that the gatekeepers use to sacrifice the innocent and protect the powerful. We can't participate in a system that prioritizes technical piety over protecting people, because a religion that does so is demonic. As the religious machinery continues to fracture, thousands of disillusioned, wounded believers will stand amid the rubble. There will be victims of the shield who were crushed to protect the powerful, and young people whose faith was tied to a political identity that has since failed them. They won't need an "I told you so." They'll need a table. Because the religious establishment has too often allowed its sanctuaries to become hunting grounds, the altar has become a trap. Therefore, our job is neither to remodel their crumbling temple nor to gloat over the ruins. Our job is to dig wells for the exiles. We must head into the dirt and fresh air of the wilderness to build communities of thick hospitality and non-anxious presence where people can find Jesus again, entirely stripped of nationalism, the grift, and the power games. Let the gatekeepers confront their illusions and weep over their own friendly fire. We have a different calling. May we be found not on the hill of vengeance, cheering for the fire, but in the city streets, tending to the wounded and pointing them to the only mercy that can save us all. Thank you for spending time with me today in what's undeniably a heavy, difficult space. Looking into the abyss of a dying nation is exhausting work, but diagnosing the rot is the first step toward the wilderness. If this episode helped clarify the chaos of our current cultural moment, or if you know someone who feels politically and spiritually homeless right now, please share this with them. Hit the subscribe button, leave a rating, and write a review. It sounds like a small thing, but in a digital world that algorithmically rewards performative outrage and tribal warfare, your engagement is the only way this message reaches the exiles who need to hear it most. I also want to keep this conversation going. Head over to our Substack to read the full, unabridged transcript of today's essay. Drop into the comments and let's talk about what it actually looks like to adopt the wilderness ethic in your own neighborhood and how we can practically begin setting that table. Finally, for those who have asked how to support the work we are doing here at The Faithful Citizen, there's a link in the show notes to join our paid subscription tier. I want to be entirely clear, this is completely voluntary. We're deeply committed to keeping all of these essays and podcasts freely accessible to anyone who needs them. But your financial support is exactly what sustains the research and production required to keep doing this work with the sobriety it demands. Until next time, let the gatekeepers fight their illusions and guard their empty fortresses. We have a different calling. Keep building tables, keep sharing the bread, and keep the chairs welcoming. I'm Ellison Keller, and this has been The Faithful Citizen.